Top Med Talk. Monty Mythen here, Editor-in-Chief of Top Med Talk, working from my home in London in England, doing my bit with regards to self-isolation, but preparing to go back into the critical care trenches with my colleagues in the days and weeks to follow. So doing a lot of preparation here in London, that's the name of the game. I've just left a great meeting, a virtual meeting from my colleagues at University College London Hospital. I've now arranged to catch up with somebody I have shared an office with in the past, but not too much of that going on at the moment, or actually not much going on in the past. Dan, you can tell that story another day. Dr. Dan Martin, who's a very good friend of Top Med Talk. We've had him on the podcast numerous occasions before. An expert on human tolerance of hypoxia. So he has climbed Everest, that he's experienced low levels of oxygen himself at the extreme, but also an intensivist, but a specialist in dangerous transmissible diseases. We've also recorded his previous experiences about Ebola virus and him being part of a global team that effectively and safely applied critical care to UK patients returning with Ebola who went on to survive. So Dan, first of all, how are you, mate?
I'm very well, actually. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's very important that all of us keep an eye out for each other in these very challenging times. Thank you.
And are you managing to get away from the office environment we're not needed clinically? And are you getting your colleagues to phone in more rather than meet face-to-face? Is that working for you?
We are slowly getting there now. Like many institutions, I'm sure it takes a bit of time to get used to. So we try to have daily departmental meetings via a video conferencing system now, so that people don't just come in simply to share information. They only come in for their allocated clinical shifts. But of course, there are still many larger scale meetings within the hospital itself, which are important in these days that we have to prepare the entire hospital for what is to come.
Yeah, I think one of the plus sides of this is people will start to understand how to use their virtual communication equipment more effectively in a positive way.
A lot of people have got used to technology very quickly, which is a nice and positive thing.
And how are things at the Royal Free? So you work at the Royal Free Hospital, which is one of our major teaching hospitals in London. I was going to say in central London. You probably don't think of it that way, but globally people, I think, would think of it as being in central London. How's it all going?
Not too bad at the moment. I guess we were at a bit of an unfair advantage from the outset because we are one of the 4 commissioned high-consequence infectious diseases units. So we had always been prepared for this sort of thing, but not on this scale at all. So we are prepared for a small number of patients with airborne infections in the hospital and on the ICU, but clearly not this overwhelming situation that we see now. So we did already have protocols and drills in place and had rehearsed much of what we are doing now. But I think the playing field has been levelled and everyone has caught up with us very quickly, I'm glad to say.
So I think everyone's been taking what we've learned to say as donning and doffing, the wearing of personal protective equipment, much, much more seriously. And I think everyone's getting pretty good at it now. Obviously, your centre's always, in recent years, been extremely good at it. But that's a key component, isn't it? That we practice and we take it very seriously.
Absolutely right. We know from all the work that's been done before and very clear messages that are coming from our Italian colleagues that above all else, you need to protect yourself. And that is meticulous use of the PPE that is described to us by Public Health England and sticking to that, to the letter. It may get difficult as time goes on. As we know, there have been supply problems, but I think there is much happening at the moment to try and ensure a steady supply of PPE to the front line.
There's an ongoing debate about the appropriate level of or amount of oxygen. We don't want to load the bases here and bring our own biases to play with regards to human tolerance of hypoxemia, but even within the allowed and accepted clinical boundaries, if we turn the oxygen down closer to the lower thresholds that we regard as acceptable, we're going to save a lot of oxygen. Oxygen is a drug and it's precious and it's starting to potentially run out. Some thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. First of all, from the supply perspective, there's been some very detailed work going on across the country and centrally to try and make sure that there is a continuous supply of oxygen to the hospital, so that the manufacturing of it and the upscaling of the manufacture, and perhaps more challenging, the distribution of that oxygen, particularly the liquid oxygen form that comes to our hospitals to fill the giant containers outside the hospitals, because clearly those who distribute the oxygen normally are likely to become unwell as the pandemic spreads. So we do need to be mindful about how much oxygen we are using in the hospital, which is not to say that we should be mean or stingy with it in any way, but we mustn't waste it. And certainly from a national perspective, we have been asked as intensivists to consider the possibilities if a shortage arose. Would we tolerate slightly lower oxygen saturations in our patients than is recommended currently? And there is certainly a vogue for that anyway before this pandemic arose, based on some of the recent findings from randomized control trials. There is a couple of bigger trials out there now with some conflicting information, and clearly more work needs to be undertaken. But I think if oxygen supplies do become short, then we will need to reconsider the fact that lowering our targets may not be as harmful as we previously thought it was.
I think we've always commonly clinically accepted a saturation target of about 90, maybe even 92%. But it's very, very common for the saturations to be 98 or 99% and the oxygen tension in the blood to be supranormal. That's the bit we just want to see if we can trim down a bit, isn't it?
I agree. And I think this will be a very good opportunity to do that, just to be a bit more meticulous about our use of oxygen and not let the oxygen saturations drift up to the higher end of the targets. There's a natural tendency within us to supranormalize. It's a sort of human nature. We give people a range to put their oxygen saturation between, and people naturally want to go for the higher end of that target. I guess my advice would be is to give the least amount of oxygen possible to achieve the lower end of that range. So not necessarily at this stage altering those ranges, but just aim for the lower end with the least amount of oxygen possible to do that. And that will save oxygen with what we think not cause any excess in harm at all.
We've got a potential conflict of interest here I've just remembered, because we have been part of a research group that's tried to develop servo-controlled oxygen metering. But if anyone's out there, as we're accelerating this sort of open source engineering solutions to make the world a better place, think about that one.
So it's a very good opportunity now. Many of the universities are closed and people are sat at home wondering what to do. So putting a bit of thought into simple devices for the delivery of oxygen to patients, either by a face mask or a ventilator, would be great use of time if you've been banished from your university.
Yeah, I think we've got a working prototype. It sounds like as though we're really advertising hard now, Dan, but if anyone has got the energy and the time and the enthusiasm, I think we can let them have that working prototype.
100%.
Yeah, totally. So, Dan, one of the big discussions at the moment, based on our Italian colleagues' experience, we were lucky enough to put out some podcasts earlier in the week with some direct reports from Bergamo, the sort of hotbed of the outbreak in Italy, and their overwhelming of the healthcare system, is that their strong advice coming out now seems to be that the rush to intubation and mechanical ventilation will overwhelm critical care. And actually, if we went back to business as usual, in other words, the escalation through supplemental oxygen and then using a device to give what we call continuous positive pressure administration of oxygen with high flows, etc., that we might be able to avoid intubation and mechanical ventilation in a very, very large number of patients. Now, as we stand currently at the moment, we were, I think, nationally not recommending those systems because of the fear of aerosolization and disease spread. But as we get into this being more pandemic, does that not become a moot point if we're careful with our personal protection? What do you think we're going to do nationally?
Absolutely, and this is a key component of our strategy, whether or not to use this continuous positive airway pressure, CPAP, and we've been thinking very, very hard about it over the last 24 hours nationally. I was a part of the group which came up with those initial guidelines for the management of these patients, and we had very little to base our strategy on at that point. We had information from the H1N1 and SARS outbreaks, and a small amount of information which had at that time come out of China. And those three settings had really shown us that for whatever reason, the use of CPAP and non-invasive ventilation had not been very successful at all, and that most people put on it had then gone on very rapidly to be intubated to receive mechanical ventilation. Now, the large amount of anecdotal information that's coming from the Italian hospitals that have been most affected by this now show a very different picture. This is not research or published data as yet, but many people around the UK have a sort of direct contact with the intensivist in Italy, including yourself, and the overwhelming story from them is that CPAP has prevented a large number of patients from going on to be intubated and receiving mechanical ventilation. So we've been looking at what information there is over the last 24 hours, and a small group of us have been asked to draw up some revised clinical management guidelines based on the experience that the Italians are describing to us. So I think what you will see from us, without sort of giving anything away too much, is that this is a modality of providing oxygen for patients that we need to give some very careful consideration to, because it may help ease the pressure on the intensive care units. You mentioned quite rightly this potential for what's been described as aerosolization. There's a small amount of information in the literature showing that there is some droplet spread of infection from these modalities, either NIV or CPAP, but it's very, very small and very limited to a small area around the patient, probably considerably less than 1 meter. So as long as the healthcare worker looking after these patients is wearing proper protection, so PPE, then this is likely to be a very safe way of managing patients. And the Italians are not reporting high levels of healthcare worker infection as a result of this. So I think we need to rethink the model and look at whether this will work for us as a country, because clearly we are not going to have enough ventilators and ICU beds and staff if we simply intubate everybody who becomes hypoxemic with this disease.
And there's been a lot in the popular press about asking various different manufacturers to make what's been described as ventilators for us. For those people listening who are not familiar with these different types of technologies, you can actually make a ventilator remarkably easily. That sounds like a bit of a pithy, blithe comment, but when they were originally made, they were made with car parts. But this CPAP type of technology, which very much depends on the energy that comes from the high-pressure gas supply, is much, much easier to replicate and manufacture. Is that right, Dan?
Absolutely. You're right. A ventilator is not a particularly sophisticated piece of equipment.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Dan, but it's making it sound terrible. Its modern form, the modern ventilators are like F1 racing cars, but we can do quite a lot with a very basic go-kart.
Yes, the go-kart model, as you described, would work adequately in the situation. But the CPAP devices are very easy to manufacture. And there's certainly been talk about bringing in technologies such as 3D printing to make these things en masse. Not an area I'm personally involved in, but I can't imagine that would be too challenging.
So this guidance, can you name-check some of the people involved, or would that be asking too much?
The Intensive Care Society in the United Kingdom has set up a wider group to look at a whole spectrum of different issues to basically rapidly deploy small groups of people to tackle very specific problems and turn them around fast. So myself, Hugh Montgomery, Mervyn Singer, Nick Hart, Richard Beale have been tasked with looking at this very quickly, the CPAP situation, and trying to come up with some rational information which will then be looked at by the larger group, and then we will share that guidance with National Health England, the NHS England, with Public Health England, to make sure that we're not sort of overstepping the mark and saying something which is outside of the other national bodies. So it's got to be done quickly, but it's also got to be done in the right way.
But that's an absolute, for those people who don't recognise all of those names, I'm guessing most intensivists listening will recognise all of them. That's an absolutely stellar group of entrepreneurial and great leaders in critical care getting on with that. So thank you very much. Now, you might get pinged for gender diversity issues in your initial social media release, but I'm sure you'll be let off. So, Dan, anything to wrap? Because I know you need to get back on to doing all this great work for our country and for the world.
Just simply that the time that we're in at the moment, people should still be using it to prepare for what is coming. I think we all understand now that this is just the beginning of a very sustained wave of this pandemic. I think that we're all going to be affected by this, probably physically and psychologically. It's a time for us all to sort of pull together and work as a team. And I think there will be some very dark days ahead, but we need to work as a team to get through it. And we need to also be mindful of the fact that things will change over time. What we like as a group of clinicians is to be given a sort of SOP or a set of rules, and we just follow those rules. The game is changing on an almost daily basis here, and we must avoid being frustrated by the rules changing all the time. We need to adapt to overcome this microbe, and it's a very malleable process indeed that we need to use to get through this.
It's also quite liberating in some way, Dan. I feel like I'm a young man on intensive care again, without the important shadow in many ways of the regulators. We've sort of been giving a bit of space, because it's crisis management, to crack on and safely do the right thing by being ingenious.
I couldn't agree more, and for very important reasons, things which we would have taken years for us to get through, all the various regulatory bodies and sort of chin scratching and various other things that goes on, have just happened in a heartbeat. Because if we explain to people this is what we need and we need it now, and the system will change and look like this tomorrow, everybody switches, we get what we need immediately. So the whole National Health Service has changed its thinking, and it realises it must be very adaptive to get through it.
It's quite liberating. It's produced quite an unusually cheery atmosphere in many places, because of the loss of the drudgery of the things that people have been complaining have been piling up for the last 10 years, etc., etc. I just really hope, looking forward, that we can keep a lot of that in the cupboard when we get out the other side of this, and not decide to take it all back out and reconstruct it again.
I hope so. I hope it will leave a sort of lasting imprint in people's minds, and that we can sort of rethink the way that we work things usually.
Great stuff, Dan. Well, thank you and your colleagues for all your fantastic work. I know you popped out to the shops this morning. How was it? Any loo paper? Any vegetables? Yeah,
so that's an interesting and disappointing component of all of this. And I guess if there's any members of the public out there listening, the message would be, please don't panic buy. So I'm on nights all weekend. I went to the 2 local supermarkets near me, and there was nothing. No food, nothing. So I'm going to have a pretty hungry few days on call. And that's a bit disappointing. And I see it in the news this morning, a very sort of heart-wrenching video from a critical care nurse who just finished clearly a bunch of shifts and went to a supermarket and saw the same thing. Very emotional plea to people to not panic buy. So I think as time goes on, this will become a pretty serious issue. Healthcare workers having no access to food. It's not going to be good.
Some shops are talking about a sort of amnesty. We've been lucky in our community here so far. We haven't been raped too badly. It's all been quite respectful. But if you are a hoarder, it's okay to hand stuff out. And it's okay to give stuff back. It's going to be. There's plenty of supplies out there. And I know you feel guilty and you feel bad about what you've done now, but the way to appease that is just to go round and hand them out to your neighbours if they need them and say sorry. It's all right.
I think that would be a great way to solve the problem.
All right. Cheers, Dan. Great to talk to you. Stay safe, and thanks for all your hard work. We'll talk again in about a week if that's okay.
I'll be delighted to. Thank you very much, Monty.
Cheers, buddy. Bye.
Top Med Talk.